And we have been looking at different 5 aspects. We're looking at personalities, the figures, the key characters of the Bible that appear in the powers of the world. We have been looking at the history. We've gone through as much as possible chronologically. We've been looking at the geography and how the Bible has changed, or the geography of the Bible, the names, the dates, the timeline. We're looking at the politics, looking at the differences in the Persian and Greek empires, and now going into the Roman Empire. A lot of politics involved. We've been also looking at the theology. The theological class. It is church-based class, a Bible-based class. So it matters greatly what God thinks. It matters greatly how we understand God in the unraveling of these powers of the world in the Bible. The last time I was here, I think it's 2 weeks ago, we looked at the Hasmonean dynasty, right? Looked at the Hasmonean dynasty. And we looked at, after the Maccabean revolt, after Antiochus Epiphanes and Judah Maccabees, and the line that comes from Mattathias or Hasmonea, their ancestor, the Hasmoneans, and how they ruled their fellow Jews. And we went all the way down to Mariamne, the last legitimate Hasmonean, the mother of Herod Agrippa, the wife of Herod the Great. But I want us to take a step back, because for us to understand the coming in of Christ, we need to understand the 4th empire that Daniel speaks about. So we're going to go back to Daniel. Daniel has been really our book in understanding all these things. So we're going to go back to Daniel. We're going to look at Daniel chapters 2 and 7, because they are the chapters where Daniel sees these visions. In chapter 2, he interprets the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, who's the one who sees a dream or has a dream. In chapter 7, Daniel himself has a vision of the 4 great empires that would arise, culminating in the coming of Christ. So, as we move forward, we can just begin looking at that. So right there is the Roman Empire. Now, as I suspected, you might not be able to see the development. The people who came up with this World History Encyclopedia, so this is in the public domain. You can be able to get it for yourself. It shows how it grew over the course of the centuries that it grew. And you can see, right, so of course, Rome is in Italy. And the right question to ask as we begin is, why isn't it called the Italian Empire and rather the Roman Empire? It's because Italy did not actually exist the way we understand it. Of course, there was an area called Italy by the time the New Testament arises. But the Italy that you know, that long, it looks like a leg kicking a ball. The ball is Sicily and Sardinia, probably 2 balls, juggling them. That's Italy right there. And Italy had always been various nations bunched up together. They were just located in the same geographical region. And so the people that dwelt in that region were called the Etruscans. And The Romans were different from the Etruscans. They were not the same ethnic group. So the Romans, over time, they conquered the Etruscans. They made pacts with them. And for a long time, only the people who lived in the Italian peninsula, so the peninsula would be Italy, what is Italy today, including Sicily and Sardinia, and as well as parts of North Africa. So all that was what came to be known as the Roman, it's not the Roman kingdom, but really the people under that geographical region were the people who for a long time could only boast to be Roman citizens. Anyone else who was outside that region could belong to the Roman Empire, but not as a citizen, as a subjugated, maybe a second-class citizen. Now, by the time of the New Testament, all that has changed. All that has changed. Of course, Rome is now an empire by the time of the New Testament, and someone like Paul, who was born in Tarsus, that's in Antioch, Syria. That's just to the very east of the Roman Empire, near Jerusalem, to the north of it, Syria. Because Antioch was in Syria. That's where, Tarsus was in Cilicia, actually. Antioch was the one that was in Syria. So Tarsus, to the south of Turkey, is where Paul grew up, and he could boast to be a Roman citizen by the time the New Testament arises. So anyway, this is just to give you an idea of how far the Roman Empire extended. With Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom more towards the white part, towards Iraq and Iran. What you see called the Parthian Empire. So the Persian Empire later became known as the Parthian Empire. And from there arises the Ottomans that took over Europe in 1453. So you have that happening. And then Nebuchadnezzar did not go as far as Turkey. All right? That's Babylon. Persia comes into play. Persia takes over Iran and Iraq, Syria, and the Middle East, and now goes all the way to the border of Turkey, except that red region to the very west of Turkey, because that was still part of the Greek League of Nations. It wasn't an empire then. And that's where the Greeks and the Persians began to clash, because of that borderland to the west of Turkey. And of course, in 323 arises Alexander the Great from Macedonia, north of Greece. He brings together the Greek Empire, crosses the Hellespont into Turkey, pushes back the Persians all the way back, takes over all the way to Iraq, extends it all the way to India, even to the border of China. That's how far he went. So that's Alexander the Great. And so the East, really he takes over, and of course, down into Egypt and what would be parts of Sudan today. That's as far as Alexander the Great goes, and the kingdoms that spring out of him. And we looked at the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And then now the Roman Empire comes, and over time, they are more interested in the West. So this is the first time the West, Europe, becomes part of empire. It's under Rome. It's not under the other empires. And so Gaul, that would today be known as France, and Britannia, which is of course today Britain, and Iberia, which is today Spain, parts of Portugal, and Carthage, which is today's Tunisia, and all these parts of North Africa, all the way to the Middle East. What I can say, the best way to look at it is to look at the Mediterranean and see that the Romans subjugated all geographical regions around the Mediterranean. That's going to be very important for understanding of how Christ came. You can go on to the next slide. So I'll try to be as fast as possible. This is just another diagram explaining the same thing. I don't have time to do that. So we'll go to Daniel 2. Daniel 2 is the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, and he, after having this dream, unlike other kings who would tell the dream and then ask for interpretation, and Nebuchadnezzar quickly knew, these people are just going to tell me what they think the interpretation is. Says basically, you're going to tell me my dream, and then you're going to tell me my interpretation, otherwise. And so, of course, the magicians, the mages of Nebuchadnezzar and the wise men, they think it's unfair. Who can do this? Ordinarily, you tell the dream, our job is to interpret. Nebuchadnezzar says no, and he gives an ultimatum. God raises a man, Daniel. This is chapter 2. We've been introduced to him in chapter 1. And Daniel comes, and he had actually commanded in verse 12, because he was angry and very furious, that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed, because no one could tell him his dream. So he realized this is a scam. I have a ministry of people who are just eating the king's money. So they sought Daniel. So we read in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they prayed. And then in verse 31, Daniel begins interpreting the dream, still in chapter 2. He tells him his dream. And then in verse 36, he tells him his interpretation. So the dream, just to read it, you saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you. Its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So he interprets. But I'm only interested in the last, because the interpretation of the first portion of the image, the gold, is Babylon. The second is the Medo-Persian Empire, the chest and arms of silver. And then the middle and thighs of bronze is the Greek Empire. And then the iron and clay. The iron first, and then the iron and clay in the feet is the Roman Empire. And so he interprets this in verse 40, and there shall be a fourth kingdom. So this is now the fourth kingdom that we've come to, strong as iron. Listen to this description, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. That's the primary description of that portion. The gold was for glory and the silver, but the iron doesn't have the kind of aesthetic glory. That's not what the Romans were after, but really the shattering to pieces. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all this, that is, all the previous empires. And as you saw, the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. As the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And as you saw, verse 43, the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in those days, and in the days of those kings, verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. This is why we are sure this is the Roman Empire, because really, the Lord set up his kingdom by sending his son. He was born in those days of the kings of iron and clay. Will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Let's just jump to chapter 7 quickly. And in chapter 7, it's another description. So this is now Daniel's own vision of 4 beasts. And the first 3 beasts have descriptions. He begins by saying beasts that come out of the sea. The first is like a lion, has eagle's wings. So there's descriptions that you can relate to here. The second is like a bear The third is like a leopard with 4 heads. Remember the Greek kingdom, the 4 generals. So again, we're sure that the 4th kingdom comes after Greece, and that's Rome. So he says in verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. For the first time, he's not describing this beast using animals. And that's a very important thing. He says, it had great iron teeth. It's very terrifying. Again, if you're having a nightmare, and this is the thing you're seeing, it's terrifying. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up from among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And as I looked, thrones were placed, and now he speaks of the Ancient of Days, and the one who looks like a man, the Son of Man, who comes and approaches the Ancient of Days. It's in the midst of that. Again, very, very parallel with the Roman Empire and the coming of Christ in the midst of the Roman Empire. So this is the Roman Empire. So you can see the various descriptions there. The feet of iron and clay, and it is a divided kingdom, partly strong, partly brittle. And there are 2 ways to interpret this, at least from my perspective, is that this is the mixing of various ethnic groups, because as Rome conquered the various ethnic groups, it's very difficult to make them live under one rule. There is no particular distinct culture that they will take up. It was very difficult for the Romans, actually, to make the world speak Latin. Latin began being spoken regularly, probably in the 300 ADs. That's very late. And so they were dealing with many groups of people. But the other way to interpret it is in the sense that Rome had a Senate, but also had military generals that were very ambitious, and they never saw eye to eye. So you could look at it in either of those ways. Either way, I think it still makes the same point. The result is the same. The 10 horns, 10 kings, which I think, it refers to the various kingdoms or kings that emerge. Now, this, of course, betrays me as not being a dispensational, because there are those who would interpret this differently. But, there's that dispensational view as well. That is speaking about a future that has not yet occurred. I believe that this has occurred, but I also believe that it is a type of what has not occurred. So if you're asking whether I believe in the Antichrist, yes, I do believe there's an individual called the Antichrist who shall emerge. And then we have the stone, of course, that destroys all these kingdoms. This is the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, and that's, of course, the church with the king that is Christ, the kingdom of Christ that will never be outdone. You can go to the next slide, sorry. And I thought I had another slide that was describing more, but I think that's sufficient. Again, because of time, we need to move on. So basically, the Bible is not silent about Rome. That's the point I wanted to make by showing you that it is prophesied in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. It is prophesied in great detail, actually, in terms of its descriptions, in terms of its Rome's ferocious militaristic expansion. Okay? Those teeth of iron, that iron aspect of shattering is described quite well. So having done that, I want to very quickly, you'll forgive me because I'll take you through this curriculum very quickly. There's no time. This needs, I think, at least 2 classes, but we don't also have time to keep breaking up classes. So we're going to look at the Roman Empire. It's going to help us to understand how they began, to understand the eras, the periods that Rome was in. And this is eventually going to help us. For you to understand Herod the Great, you need to understand three things. You need to understand the Greek Empire, because you need to understand the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the Maccabean revolt, because that's going to help you understand the second thing, the Hasmonean dynasty, because Mariamne is from the Hasmonean dynasty. And then you need to understand the Roman Empire. This is why I've begun with all those. So our next class will be on the Herodian dynasty. This is why I had to begin with Rome. So let's just look at the Roman, what would become the Roman Empire. So Rome was not born an empire, right? I saw one of our members write on WhatsApp that she would want to know where the phrase Rome was not built in a day comes from. And that's the idea. It wasn't built in a day. There isn't much magic to that. But the point is that it began as a village. The Romans were actually farmers, agrarian. They were an agrarian community. So they farmed. And there's the mythical story of how Rome began in 2 or 3 sentences. 2 brothers, Remus, Romulus, are born. Jumped into a river. A wolf finds them. Lupus is the name of the wolf. Raises them, gives them milk, breastfeeds them. And so they grow up, very ferocious. That's the idea that the Romans want you to believe of Romulus and Remus. But then Romulus and Remus, they go to build a city. They're grown up now. How they knew how to build, I don't know. But they've grown up. They are in the 7 hills of Rome. So Rome is set up on 7 hills. And they're thinking where to build a city. And they disagree. One wants to build on one side of the hills, and the other one wants to build on the other. And so they start competing. They build on each side. And it goes that Remus, they were twins, by the way. Remus goes and mocks Romulus as he's building, basically, like child's play, saying, mocking, what kind of building is this? Even wolves can jump over, and to demonstrate, he jumps over the wall. And Romulus is furious and kills his brother. And that's how Rome began. So he builds a city, and it begins, with a ferocious hunt. That's the mythical story. However, it is more likely that they began as an agrarian community, and they began conquering the various Etruscans that were around them. And basically, that's how the Roman Empire grew. But I have here the 3 eras or periods of Rome. So Rome is subdivided into 3 periods. Most people know only the Roman Empire. They don't consider that there was a history for Rome. Rome began as a village about 750 BC. Now, is there anyone who can remember what's happening in the Bible around that time? Any idea? Right. So you have the 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom goes into exile in 722 BC. Assyria takes them to exile. And who is prophesying in the southern kingdom at this time? Isaiah. So that's around the time that Rome, can identify itself as a distinct kingdom, because it began as a kingdom. So you have the period of the monarchy, about 250 years, between 750 BC to 500 BC. Again, what happened around 500 BC? Anyone can remember the class? So the southern kingdom, Judah, went into exile. There were 3 sackings, one in 605, the other one in 593, and the last one, so the first one, Daniel went into exile 605, together with King Jeconiah. Jehoiakim, and so they go into exile in the first king of 605. In 593, Ezekiel goes into exile. So they don't go together. The Bible tells us this. And then in Zedekiah becomes king, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And so in 586, Nebuchadnezzar personally comes, flattens Jerusalem, and destroys the temple. 70 years later, 586 minus 70, 516, the temple is rebuilt by Zerubbabel. So around 500 BC is when, that's around the time that Rome shifts from being a kingdom to a republic. So what do we mean? The republic, they replaced their kings with a senate. The Senate for a long time was made up of 300 senators. There were many changes. As the Senate grew over the centuries, as it happens in politics, the elite, the ruling class, forgot about the needs of the lower social class. And so people rebelled. And basically what happened after the people rebelled, they were told, okay, we'll give you some political offices. And so they were given an assembly. Voting could now happen, even though the votes were still based on the social class that you came from. A person who came from the elite had a much greater say than a person from a lower social class. But it became a republic. 300 senators, later 600 senators. That happened for almost 500 years because it began in 509. The date is not actually 500. Should have written the actual date, 509 to 27 BC. 27 BC is when Augustus, Octavian, became known as Augustus. That's a title. It's not his actual name. It means what it means. The August one. The Reverend. The Holy One. Right? Divine title. Augustus Caesar. And that went on for almost another 500 years, up to 476 AD, when Rome finally collapsed. So you can go to the next slide. As I said, I'm going to take you quite quickly to this. So this is the period of the kings, about 750 BC to 509 BC. Romulus, remember, his brother Remus, he becomes the first king. He organized the early political structures of Rome. Even the Senate was there at this time, but the Senate really had no power. The king could just do it. It was a monarchy. So the Senate could not veto the king. So that's what Romulus set up. It was followed by all these other kings. You can see some of the names they describe. Tullus Hostilius, which where the name hostility comes from. He expanded Rome's territory. You have all this, all the way to, I'm more interested in the seventh king, Tarquinius or Tarquin, the proud. Superbus, the word superb. That's what it means. He thought himself as superb. So he was the superb, but he was nicknamed the proud. What happened is, of course, at this time, this is about, they've already had kings for more than 200 years by the time the seventh king arises. And the kings are very proud. Again, human nature. No one touches the king. So the king, basically what happened, he violated a woman and did that with impunity, and that became a big case. So the people rebelled, overthrew Tarquinius, and the Senate was now given the power. You can go on to the next slide. SPQR was embedded into a stone in Rome. SPQR are the initials for the Senate, populace, the population, and what are? We'll see. The key stages in the expansion of Rome. 500 BC, they become a new republic. They are a city-state. Remember, again, this is not Italy. This is just Rome. They are surrounded by the Etruscans and other people groups. They begin to subjugate them so that the whole Italian peninsula comes under Rome. and is basically known as Rome. That whole period of about 250 years, up to around 264 BC. So at this time, what's happening? The Greeks are still ruling. You have that situation where the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are ruling. The king of the north, king of the south in Daniel 11 are ruling. And up to this point, 146 BC, who can remember what happened around this time? This is around the time when, after Antiochus Epiphanes is resisted by the Hasmoneans. So the Hasmonean dynasty begins in 146. So there is a sense in which the Romans helped the Hasmoneans because the Greeks were dealing with the Romans. And so their guerrilla warfare sort of worked because the Greeks had a lot to deal with. This Hasmonean dynasty that eventually led to the Herodian dynasty. You can see they have bracketed the 3 Punic Wars. Again, I'm going to march. The Punic Wars are basically, while Rome was expanding, there was another smaller empire, but one that threatened them. In fact, they were almost able to extinguish the Romans at a certain point. They were called the Carthaginian or Carthage. Carthage is modern day Tunisia and Algeria, basically all of that strip in North Africa under the Mediterranean. And they were able, in fact, Carthage was so powerful, they controlled parts of the Italian peninsula, such as Sicily and Sardinia. They even controlled Spain, at the time was known as Iberia. They controlled that whole region. And so they wanted to control the world. Just like Rome was rising, Carthage was rising. The most popular Carthaginian was a general called Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca is known because he, together with a great army and many elephants, crossed the Alps on foot with an army, marched all the way to a few kilometers to Rome, killed about 60,000 Roman warriors. The Roman senators in Rome, do you know what they did? They fled to Greece. That's how much they feared Hannibal. And Rome was left without any defense. Hannibal, rather than attacking Rome, wanted to play a cat and mouse game. That was his undoing. If he had attacked Rome immediately, he would have taken Rome. Probably today we would be speaking of a different kind of history. But he hesitated, and one Roman general came from behind and was able to destroy Hannibal. But he's known as one of the most brilliant strategic generals that have ever existed, together with Alexander the Great. I won't mention the others because the wounds are still fresh in Europe. But basically, of those times, it's Alexander the Great and Hannibal, and then Julius Caesar is the other general. And then, so Rome, in 146, deals with Greece, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and then they begin expanding now in the East, the Middle East. And they will finally take over Judea. Go on to the next slide. So this is the Carthaginian, the gray, blue, the dark color, I can't tell which it is the Carthaginian Empire. You see how little Rome controlled. That's just to give you an idea. You can go on. Right. So I've already explained the kingdom era, the rule of the 7 monarchs. Then in 509, they removed Tarquin, the proud, because of this woman, Lucretia, and the Senate began to rule. SPQR was explaining what's happening in Israel. The return from exile is happening, and the temple is being rebuilt at that time. For 50 BC, Rome comes up with what would become its constitution, the law of the 12 tablets, and it became their statutory law. What's happening in the Bible? It's about that time Malachi is beginning to prophesy. Okay? Then the Punic Wars that I've just explained, they were three. They had three major wars with Hannibal, especially towards the end. This happens from 264 to 146 BC. But Rome finally was able to conquer Carthage. They actually destroyed them very ferociously. They went and burnt the whole city, including children, just to ensure that Carthage never rises again. And this now made them the lords of the Mediterranean, because they basically took over what Carthage controlled. And so we begin seeing what Daniel had prophesied about the fourth beast, that it breaks, shatters into pieces everything that it finds. 146 BC, Rome finally lands in Greece. Now, they had been to Greece before, but this time they are able to sack Corinth. Corinth is probably the strongest city-state. The city-states, the most prominent ones were Corinth. So that area was called Thrace. There is Corinth, there is Athens, and there is Sparta. So they were able to sack Corinth and annex Greece. What annexing means is bring them under them as subjects. So Greece now becomes part of the Roman expansion. So this allows the Hasmoneans to successfully hold off Antiochus Epiphanes, because they begin fighting. And after Antiochus dies, the Greek generals fight against themselves. At the same time, they are fighting the Romans. At the same time, they are trying to fight the Hasmoneans in Judea. So they had a lot on their hands. You can go on to the next. And so, sorry, before you go on, you can see what Daniel said. The Greek Bronze Empire at this time enters the Iron Roman after they subjugated the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. 133 BC, Rome begins to change. Rome basically had two classes. You are either in the elite, called the patricians, or the common people, called the plebeians, the plebs. So the plebeians could vote, and they could decide things in an assembly, and they could elect someone called a tribune. A tribune had the power to veto what the Senate said. That's where the term veto comes. It says, I veto, I refuse. That's what it means. And so the tribune was very important. But you see the play here. The patricians, the elite social class, they only gave the plebeians one. Perhaps sometimes it was two tribunes. They had 300 senators, and the senators chose consuls. Those who led were called consuls. Consuls could only reign for 1 year, and then they had to resign, unless you became what was known as dictator. We take that word directly from the Roman language. The dictator could be voted for when Rome was in crisis. Like when Hannibal came against Rome, they thought of electing someone as dictator so that he would stabilize Rome, because the political processes could not happen as they would. So saying, someone sits on that seat for 1 year, then there's no time to vote. People have run away. A dictator would rule until such a time when the Senate would be reconstituted once again, and Senate would continue. Julius Caesar became a dictator. That's why he became so powerful. But you had to become a consul for that to happen. So a man called to kill the tribune, by the way, was punishable by death, even if you are a senator. The tribune was sacred. So a tribune called Tiberius Gracchus. There were two Gracchuses. They are Gracchi brothers. So the first Gracchi was called Tiberius, and he saw that the elite class would always have their way. And so he began trying to bypass the elite class by inciting the plebeians to veto what the senators were doing. And the Senate did not like it, and so they began sending goons to deal with Tiberius, and that's basically how Gunism was born in Rome. Because this man. Now, this is going to be very important because later on, the generals that come, like Julius Caesar, are going to use guns to threaten the Senate. So that's what happens with Gracchus. He was actually concerned about the people. And one of the issues that he was concerned with was for you to become a soldier to go to battle, you had to own land because you had to support yourself while going to battle. While they were gone in battle sometimes for a decade, the senators passed laws that ensured they took up the lands of the soldiers that were away. So when the soldiers came home, they were homeless. So he was trying to deal with that amongst other things. And so he had the support of the people in that. But of course, because he arose against the political elite, he was assassinated. His brother, Gaius, later on, arose as well. For him, he tried to give grain to the people because the senators, they now owned a lot of farmland and they were setting the prices of grain and the people could not afford it. And so he again tried to bypass the Senate to make grain affordable. Again, he was disposed of very quickly. So the Senate actually, they pursued him to kill him. So that's the Gracchi brothers. And this sets a precedent for violent suppression in Rome. It was an abomination to shed blood in the city of Rome. So it was a different thing if you did it outside of Rome. In fact, generals were required when they arrived in Rome to enter the city without their weapons, which, as we're going to see, is going to define a lot. In 107, a guy called Marius rises up. Now, basically, the patricians later came to be known as the optimates, the best men. And then you have the plebeians. They basically came to be known as the populare. Now, that had to do with progressiveness. The Senate, which the optimates were basically the Senate, they wanted things to continue, the status quo to continue. But the populares always wanted changes. And so these men that arose, some of them even arose from the Senate itself. They were, some of them, part of the elite social class, but they understood the people. And so they spoke for the people. So there became these two political parties, the optimates and the populares. So Marius arises, he's a populare, meaning he speaks for the people, he's against the Senate. Once again, that's a problem. Marius, however, was a general. One of the things that Marius did, he overturned the laws that Senate had put up about 150 years before of taking up the lands of the soldiers who went to battle. Sorry, the law was that you couldn't go to battle unless you had land. Okay, unless you could support yourself, you could prove that you had your means to support yourself. And so he overturned that, and Marius was the first general to go into battle while he himself took up the cost of his own army. That's very important because now generals begin to own armies. Before it was the Senate, the Republic of Rome that owned the army. But now, a general could actually, control the army. Now, that was not official, but that's the end result. If they're coming to you for food, for salary, once they retire, their retirement, basically you own them. And the result of that is that the army are going to be loyal to you rather than to Rome. So Marius does that. He begins a new military phase. A guy called Sulla arises later. He is an optimates against Marius, who is a populares. And it's interesting because Marius had put many senators who are part of the populares. So they had sort of become political parties. So these are for the people. Sulla marches on to Rome because he also has his own army. Remember that Marius is the one. Actually, Sulla was a general of Marius. So he had his own army. They listened to him. And the first military coup d'etat. Remember, you couldn't enter Rome with weapons. He's the first man who entered Rome with weapons, besieged the Senate, removed the senators. In fact, he's also the first person who came up with what they call death lists. Conscriptions, I think is what they're called. Countries like Russia and North Korea practice this a lot. If you're on a death list by the political leader, wherever you are, you've gone. And we've seen that in Kenya with the abductions. Sulla invented that. And so he began to systematically remove people from the Senate. And then he expanded the Senate from 300 to 600 and then put his men in the Senate. He became dictator. A dictator could he couldn't be vetoed. What he said was law. But interestingly, after 1 year, he gave up his senatorialship and went back to his village farm to retire and go on to the next. Then, just during that time when he's retired, rises a man called Pompey. He's called Pompey the Great. Pompey is the man who basically captured Jerusalem. Remember the Hasmoneans? There was a time during the Hasmonean dynasty, two brothers were fighting for the throne. And they thought, each of them thought, I'll bribe the Romans to come and help me fight my brother. But they thought the same thing. So both of them bribed Pompey. Pompey, so one was called Aristobulus, the other one was called Hyrcanus. Pompey noticed that Hyrcanus was weak and could be controlled, but Aristobulus was very stubborn and he didn't like him. So he put Hyrcanus on the throne. Aristobulus didn't take that, came and besieged Jerusalem while Pompey was away, took over, and so Pompey had to calm himself with a Roman army. Remember, he's a general. This is the time when generals own armies. So he comes with his army and besieged Jerusalem for a number of months. They noticed during the Sabbath, the Jews would not fight. So that's the day that they would capitalize to do the things that they would not do on an ordinary day of fight, building siege ramps. Because the Jews would do nothing. They were helpless, sort of, by their law, could do nothing. And they couldn't shoot arrows. So these guys, they come to the wall, they build siege ramps on the walls of Jerusalem while the Jews are watching. That's how Jerusalem fell, basically, to Pompey the Great. He did that over the course of months. And then he entered the Holy of Holies, but unlike Antiochus, he did not desecrate it. What surprised him when he entered the Holy of Holies is that there was no statue of a god. So he really wondered what they were worshiping, but he still let that go. Two more men are important during the time of Pompey. I know my time is out. I'll make this as brief as possible. The two men are Crassus, and Julius, as we pronounce it, Caesar. Pompey and Crassus did not see eye to eye. They hated one another greatly. Julius Caesar was a friend of Crassus and was an acquaintance of Pompey. And so basically Julius Caesar brings them together. These are three generals, each with their own armies. Julius Caesar realizes they can actually subjugate the Senate if they came together. And so they put their enmity aside and came together and formed what is called the first triumvirate. It was not official, because the second one was. It was not official, and so they became a cartel. They could do whatever they wanted in Rome, in the whole empire. Julius Caesar, to seal this deal, gave his daughter to Pompey, but his daughter died as she was delivering Pompey's child. And so the pact did not last long. Crassus, meanwhile, went to fight in Parthia in the east, in Persia, and was killed there. And so the triumvirate didn't last long. And Julius Caesar and Pompey, who didn't like each other, really, now came to a head. And the Senate, again, saw an opportunity to redeem themselves, and so they supported Pompey so that he would destroy Caesar, but Caesar was too bright for Pompey. He crushed Pompey. Pompey, meanwhile, escapes to Egypt. In Egypt, the last Ptolemy the 13th, and his sister Cleopatra have just inherited the throne as teenagers after Ptolemy the 12th has died. And so they saw Pompey as a father figure. But they began to fight, this brother and sister, Ptolemy 13 and Cleopatra. Pompey doesn't want to be involved in their politics. But in the midst of that, Ptolemy the 13th, the young boy, kills Pompey, thinking Caesar will like it and support him in his bid against his sister Cleopatra. Caesar was not amused. He dealt with Ptolemy the 13th brutally, killed him, and put Cleopatra on the throne. Long story short, Cleopatra became his mistress. They had a child together, Caesarion, little Caesar. So all that happens within this period. So we're about between 50 to 44 BC. This is just before Jesus is born. So that happens. Caesar crosses the Rubicon River. That's where the term the die is cast. What's done is done comes from. If you cross the Tiber, the Rubicon, you are considered to be an enemy of Rome. And this is why they sent Pompey to deal with Caesar, but he was unable. And so in the Battle of Phasaelos, Pompey is killed by Ptolemy the 13th after he's escaping from Caesar. You can go on to the next slide. So this is basically towards the end. Caesar became named as dictator perpetual. He was not interested in letting the seat go, so he was to be perpetual dictator until he died. Which meant the Senate basically was his tool. So now Rome stops being a republic the way it has been for almost 500 years, and it's now under the whims of one man. The very thing they tried to escape in 509 BC happens. They didn't like that, and so basically two men, I cannot remember one man's name right now because we get a name from him, Brutus, and Cassius is the other man. They incited the senators who are interested in returning the power of the Republic, of the Senate back over Rome. They killed Caesar in March. We know the date. I think it's 15th of March, 44 BC, as he was seated on his seat, because the dictator would sit on a throne in the Senate. That's spitting in their faces. The Senate was supposed to represent the freedom of the people, but here is a monarch sitting on it. So Cassius and Brutus came, and they seemed like they wanted to whisper something to Caesar. Caesar had a young general called Mark Antony, who they delayed because they knew that Mark Antony would spoil their plans. It came as if they were whispering something to Caesar. They stabbed him 23 times. And Caesar was brutally murdered. That's where the name brutal comes from. Because Brutus stabbed Caesar in the back. So Mark Antony, this young general of Caesar, should have been the heir apparent of Caesar. But surprise, in Caesar's will, he wrote his nephew Octavian as his successor. Mark Antony did not like it, but he had no option. They had a short fight with Octavian, but basically they came together in the interest of pursuing the assassins of Caesar, and they were able to defeat them in the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Brutus and Cassius, they committed suicide, and now the Republic died. So Octavian and Mark Antony have defeated these enemies. But remember, Mark Antony thinks, I should have been the one to receive the kingdom and not Octavian. And so they're not friends. But then there's another young general who is also quite influential. His name was Lepidus. And so they formed the second triumvirate. They realized once again they could do what their forefathers had done. They put Rome under their wings. They basically used Rome to raise taxes for themselves, became very wealthy, until Mark Antony and Octavian did not see eye to eye, and civil war broke in Rome. And this civil war went on for a time up to 31 BC, around 30 BC, at the Battle of Actium. So what happened is Mark Antony met Cleopatra, the woman who had Caesar's son, basically became his mistress. And he tried to use Egypt's resources to fight against Octavian, because Octavian had his own resources. Most of the Roman army defected to Octavian because they really loved Caesar. So this is the nephew of Caesar. So they came to him. Basically, the result of that is that at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. And Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt. While in Egypt, Antony received word that Cleopatra has committed suicide, but it was a false report. And so he bemoans it. He says, "You are more of a man than me. I should have been the first one to commit suicide." And so he takes a knife, stabs himself. While he's dying, he is told she actually did not commit suicide. So they rush her to Cleopatra, his lover. Cleopatra, he dies in Cleopatra's hands, and Cleopatra also commits suicide. And that's the end of the Ptolemies in 30 BC. And so Caesar, Octavian Caesar now, becomes the undisputed ruler of Rome. All his major enemies are dead. Egypt becomes part of Rome now. And so the whole mass people worship. Sounds familiar? Some of our political leaders? That's exactly what the Senate did. And that's how Augustus slid into, he didn't force anyone, just slid into becoming the first Roman Empire. So Luke chapter 2, is to end this. Jesus is born in between 6 and 4 BC. We began late. We began about 20 minutes late. This is why I have struggled to really bring this class, knowing it was very packed. Luke 2. So went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, a trough, because there was no place for them in the inn. 750 years of Rome's existence and its changes from kingdom to republic to empire under Caesar Augustus was leading us to Luke chapter 2, verse 1 onwards. Caesar Augustus, as we've read here, is Luke recording. His word was law in the whole world. That is an emperor. That's not a king. That's not an ethnarch. That's not a chief. That's an emperor. And what Daniel had prophesied about Rome became true, that in those days of those kings, the Roman kings, the Lord raised up a kingdom that shall never end. We've seen the birth of the Messiah during the time of Augustus Caesar. We'll continue looking at the Roman Empire After we look at the Herodian dynasty, the last class. So we have 2 more classes to end the series. We look at the Herodian dynasty, and then we'll look at the Roman emperors all the way to the fall of Jerusalem, the temple in 70 AD. I hope this has helped give some context, and more of it will become clear next week as we look at Herod. Let us pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, you rule time, you rule geography, you rule history, you rule the actions of men. We have seen how these Romans conspired against one another, subjugated many kingdoms around them, dealt with competing empires, and yet ultimately it all boils down to the coming of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, to establish his eternal kingdom. So we thank you that you are ruler over all things. All things. Would you help us, Lord, to see you in your providence as King, as sovereign, to trust in you in the midst of a lot of politics that go on around us, a lot of trouble, tribulation, that all things are in your control and you do whatever you please in heaven, on earth, and in hell. So be with us, O Lord, even as we transition to the worship service. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Nilimwambia kwambie hivyo. Niambie, nitafanya masaa, nitafanya